طيب bonjour wawaganic bain Indigenous Makwana Dodem Bigwani Ashi Nishnadak Nindonjiba. Hi, I'm Cora McGuire-Surrett. I'm the Chief Executive Officer over here at the Ontario Native Women's Association, the oldest and largest Indigenous women's organization here in Canada.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ingrid Green, and I am Research and Evaluation here at ONWA.
Ingrid. So welcome everyone to our parallel event here. We really wanted to one, make space, more space within CSW 68 for Indigenous women, because we had recognized on previous years that there wasn't many Indigenous women specific events. And so we wanted to share a little bit of the knowledge that we have here with you. We also wanted to recognize that today marks the International Day of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And we at ONWA, we know that as Indigenous women and girls, we are strong and resilient despite the systemic racism that we continue to face 365 days a year. And that we work towards combating anti-Indigenous racism by empowering Indigenous women and building up our leadership and taking. Sorry, I'm just going to pause for a minute. There's some technical difficulties happening. Technology is only good when it is, and when it isn't, it isn't. So. We good? Okay, so before we get started, everything that we do here at ONWA and as Indigenous women, part of our teachings is that we always start with ceremony. We always start with teachings because we know that colonization has impacted our ways of being and knowing. And so we always begin with teachings and reclaiming reclaiming our ways of being and knowing. And so Ingrid's going to start us off with the teaching.
Ingrid, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about the rattle teachings that we've received from both Tina Armstrong and Al Hunter. And we do a lot of work with both of these individuals, and they guide us and support us in the work that we do. And we're so grateful for them and the work that they do for the people. So for us as Anishinaabe and other Indigenous people, we know that at the beginning of time, all that was heard was the sound of the rattle. We know the sound of the rattle are Creator's thoughts, and all creation come from the thoughts of Creator. At the beginning of time, Creator was alone in the darkness, thinking about the universe and hearing only their own thoughts. With the shaking of the rattle, Creator began to vision and bring into existence other life forms, human beings, birds, animals, plant beings as well. This is where we come from and how we have come to be. The sound of the rattle is the sound and story of creation. It is the beginning of who we are and what we build our knowledge from. From the rattle, we have a direct connection to the Creator. And when we shake our rattle, we are sounding our intention and bringing our visions into existence. It is our intention that guides us in our work, in our lives, to make meaningful change for ourselves, our families, and our communities. Our intention to create safety comes from those who have gone before us and goes forward to those yet to come. Miigwech.
And the turtle also represents healing. And so all the work that we do, we look at how we incorporate healing into everything that we do. Because that's, part of our ways of reclaiming, and especially when you're looking at systemic discrimination and racism that Indigenous women globally are facing. That's part of what we're seeing. And so in order to break these systemic barriers, we have to begin from a place of healing and making sure that we're not picking up colonial ways of being and knowing, and being able to practice our own ways as we're doing this work. And so that's what we're about to talk about here, is a bit about how this space here is for Indigenous women. Next slide. So one part about, the work that we're doing here at ONWA, just a little bit about who we are. So ONWA is unique as an organization, as is many other Indigenous women's organizations out there. A lot of times people will have like one main focus as an organization. You may either be, a direct service provider, or you may be a membership-based organization and association, or you're an advocacy agency or a research agency. So ONWA, with our membership and our board of directors, has decided that we're not going to stay within that small framework, and we're going to look at everything holistically within the circle. And so therefore, we're a direct service provider at 10 locations across the province of Ontario. We have over 30 Indigenous women's organizations as part of our membership base. And we're also a policy research and advocacy leader here in the province. And we've been around for well over 50 years now on advocating for solutions designed and developed by Indigenous women for Indigenous women. And so the next slide. And so part of today's work here is about making space for Indigenous women. And I just really want to be clear on the purpose for today. And I know we probably do have allies, many allies on today's call as well, and that's okay. So today is about making space for Indigenous women and recognizing that these are the 4 agreements from Don Miguel Ruiz and the ancient Toltec teachings on, we need to look at how we do this work, and with these principles, this is how we operate within as an organization. And we have to begin by being impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. What we're going to share here today, Ingrid and I, feel free to leave behind what you don't need and take what you do need. Everything that we're doing is with good thoughts and intention and purpose. We don't mean to, offend anybody, and anything that we say as we're speaking our truth and our experiences and our opinions. And so we just wanted to let you know that we're doing everything in a good way. Don't make assumptions. Feel free to please find the courage to ask questions. That's how we can grow together and be in relationship with each other, and recognizing that all the work we're doing is always about doing your best, and your best will change each day depending on what's going on in your life. So these are our agreements that we're going to follow today for our presentation. Okay, so so why we're here today. So why we're here today is really looking at systemic change and creating seeds for change. And so what you see on the screen here now is our issues wheel, which you can see as a flower. And so part of the flower is recognizing you can't touch on one issue without touching on another. And so this is what an intersectionality framework looks like within our organization. We can't talk about the destruction of Mother Earth or teachings around Mother Earth without also looking at, for instance, human trafficking or missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because we recognize they are so interconnected and interrelated. And when you're looking at addressing systemic change within these issue areas that our membership has directed us to work on, we have to begin the work through research. And we also have to look at policy changes and programming development. You have to be able to look at holistically when you're going to work on an issue. So for instance, within human trafficking, we began that work, based on what Indigenous women in community were saying they needed and what they were facing. And that work there then guided all of our work going forward. And so you can see on the screen, there's some QR codes, and the Journey to Safe Spaces report is based on the wisdom and knowledge of over 3,300 or 3,200 Indigenous people and partners that we engage with across the province of Ontario, and over 250 survivors of human trafficking. And they really provided the wisdom and guidance and knowledge for our Courage for Change program, which is, as far as we can tell to date, is the largest Indigenous anti-human trafficking program in Canada. And we continue to work with survivors and walk that journey with them. We never walk it for them. And they're the ones who are the experts on the issue. And so that's what we have to do as service providers and advocates and storytellers, is be able to honor and recognize who is the expert on these issues. And it's never us as we're working in this area. We always have to listen to Indigenous women on the ground in community, and that's where the change comes from. And so Ingrid can talk a bit about the reconciliation with Indigenous Women's Report.
So the reconciliation with Indigenous women, we did an analysis of all of our previous existing reports, as well as our ending violence against women summits and the number of times in the resolutions that we had heard from our membership and women in community about ending violence, but also about the specific issue of MMIWG, missing and murdered Indigenous women. And these recommendations came out of what these groups were telling us. And one of the things that I'm very grateful for when we get to sit with women is they tell us their truth, and we get to then advocate on behalf of what they want us to hear and what they want us to know, so that we can make change for them and help them to make change in the areas that they need us to.
So what is an Indigenous gender-based analysis? So many of you may or may not have heard of a gender-based analysis tool, which is, a framework on looking at, policy development within government on, is there any impact affecting a specific gender in a policy role? And so we were gifted our ONWA IGBA from Joan Riggs from Catalyst Research and Communications, and from many knowledge holders that she's worked with for many years, and from the grandmothers on what an Indigenous woman-specific gender-based analysis looks like. And so this is a tool that looks at an intersectional lens through which Indigenous women's lived experience are viewed to provide a better understanding. So essentially, like, what is our experience within a system, and how does that system view us as Indigenous women? How does that system respond to us as Indigenous women? And so these are some high-level kind of questions we ask when we are doing an IGBA on looking at what is the truth within our experience within that system. So if you were to take a system like healthcare, for instance, what is Indigenous women experience within the healthcare? You can look at the data if you have the data. You can hear from women in your community on what are their experiences. So it could be everything from the birthing practice and the intersectionality between healthcare and child welfare, for instance. So, the need to have, are we supporting moms on that journey? Because that's, the primary purpose for mothering is being able to see that Indigenous women have that right to be a mother, and her experience as a mother and your experience as a newborn, how have those systems treated you? And we can tell from the data, when you look at what is the truth based off of data, you can see that Indigenous women are largely overrepresented within the child welfare and the apprehensions at birth. So that's just like one example, kind of looking at what is the truth of that system, and how that system views Indigenous women. And another question we ask is, what are Indigenous women's specific safety needs that they've identified? So when you're taking the example of mothering and the birthing process, we always go back to the mothers and ask them, like, what would safety look like in a healthcare system that's responsive to you? That's where you always begin. You begin from the ground up for policy. And then what this looks at, like, what needs to be our priorities in order to support Indigenous women. So we ask them, like, what support would you need when interacting with this system? And how do we include Indigenous women in reclaiming their voice and leadership? And it's always through engagements. So I'm not sure you have anything to add.
I just think about that intersectional lens and that way of seeing and how Indigenous women are experiencing the systems, and that a lot of times as Indigenous women, we go into the world and we know that the world is going to be harder for us because we're Indigenous women, and it's not right. But knowing that it's not us, and that it's not, because of us being Indigenous. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a minute. But it's not us. And sometimes when we know that, it helps us to advocate for our needs better. And raise our voices in a way that they need to happen.
Yeah, that's one thing we've learned over the years, especially like here in Canada. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and through the TRC and through the engagement that was done through there was one key theme that had happened, which was the TRC and the survivors of residential schools spoke about one of the biggest impacts that the residential schools had on us as Indigenous women and girls was the loss of voice. And so what we have to then do is recognize if we lost our voice during that process, and our leadership, the recognition and honoring of us as Indigenous women, we know we're now where we have to begin, which is reclaiming our voice, reclaiming our leadership, reclaiming our governance. And so that's why it's so critically important when you're breaking down systemic barriers and systemic issues, is beginning where women have told us what we need to reclaim. And so one part of that is reclaiming our voice. And so here's our looking at our turtle. And so that's how we began with the turtle teachings here this morning. And so our turtle is just, everything we do as an agency is a living model. We have, when you're looking at the work you're doing, being able to incorporate our teachings, and we know that one part of our teachings is incorporating our world around us. And so, looking at the turtle has many teachings here that are connected to woman. And so one part of the turtle is, if you can see, like the head of the turtle is that, Creator's purpose for us. And the tail is, community's needs, because we're always moving in one direction or another. And the 4 feet speak to Indigenous women specific roles. And so we have a role as self within our family, within our community, within our nation. And you can talk about the inside of the turtle.
So on the inside of the turtle, we look at the issues that we've been facing, and from our reconciliation with Indigenous Women report, we came up with these 13 recommendations on how to address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, recognizing that when Indigenous women are doing well, everyone is doing well. The 28 systems on the outside of the turtle, we look at those as issue areas, that the systems that Indigenous women face and navigate daily, and experience racism and discrimination when navigating these systems. And we look, and every Indigenous woman is different. So she may be experiencing, maybe not all 28 of the issues, but, maybe 4 or 5 of them, and how they intersect with each other. When we look at child welfare, what are the other intersections of that? When we look at poverty and health, and sometimes for some Indigenous women, depending on their lived experience, they may spend more time in certain areas and have to navigate that system. When our kids are going to school, what does that look like, and how does that intersect with other areas such as child welfare, and health? So the inside of the turtle kind of represents, those places and spaces that we're navigating on the daily, and probably not the most supportive way either, right? But when we recognize what it is we're dealing with, we're better able to handle it as well, right?
Yeah, no, definitely right, Ingrid. And so when you're looking at the systems, and one part in here, you can see many of these systems by design have been designed to purposely discriminate against us as Indigenous women. And we always have to remember that. So when we're looking at what type of framework are we working in? Are we working towards, an equity framework, or are we looking for social justice? Do the two actually align up or not? Because when you're looking at, for instance, governance, the 11th system in here is this governance, and here in Canada, the Indian Act and our treaties, and you're looking at what is the truth behind that. And the system was designed and built to remove Indigenous women from governance, from our rightful place, and participating within governance and leading community through as matriarchs. And it was because women had a voice, and it's because we lead differently. I think there was a misunderstanding, when people came into our communities to look at, like, oh, women had power. Well, yes, we had power, but it was because of the way we were leading. We're leading from our heart-centered leadership. We're leading on behalf of the community. And so that's why, when we're looking at reclaiming, we have to reclaim our own leadership.
And I think a big part of that is we're navigating systems that are outside of ourselves and then outside of our ways of being and knowing. So when trying to do that, I often hear of when we speak about the language that there's governance systems built into the language specifically so that there wouldn't be, say, violence against women because of how we look at gender, and that it isn't, you know, he and her, it's more fluid, right? So there's so many, you know, pieces that we have to, you know, build into this in terms of supporting Indigenous women in the world with
Yeah.
others.
And another example is, if I can go back for a sec, when you're looking at, you know, our collective experience within the pandemic that we globally had all experienced, and the, you know, looking at the healthcare system, and immediately, I believe, you know, there was, you know, everybody had seen the light on who was really missing from the healthcare system and the privilege within healthcare. And so, you know, trying to break down the systemic issues and barriers that many communities were facing, you know, the access supply to healthcare. You know, if you're homeless, you couldn't socially isolate, you couldn't you know, be able to have sanitization access, and access to, never mind, access to water in many communities is already an issue. And so when you're looking at the healthcare and you're trying to break the systemic discrimination that's being built in there, there is another way of addressing systemic racism and discrimination, and it's also about, you can also build a new system. You know, while we're trying to address, you know, historical systemic issues, we can also build new systems. And, you know, that's one example that we have here at ONWA is that during the pandemic, Indigenous women needed access to the vaccines. And so we built a vaccine clinic, the Mindamoye Health Clinic, and we built it in 7 days. We as a team came together because we realized it was important. People's lives were on the line. And we had built the system in 7 days, and it's still running today. And it is the most successful urban Indigenous vaccination clinic we're still running. And it was because we listened to what Indigenous women said, and we have a 90, I believe it's 98 or 99% community member satisfaction survey for a healthcare system, which is really unheard of, because we built in research at the front end of that. And so now we're continuing to do that work, because while we're still working on addressing systemic issues within the healthcare, we're also building new systems at the same time to respond to the issues that women are facing.
Mhm.
Okay, so demonstrating a little bit of our IGBA in action. So if we're looking at the CSW priority theme, let's consider 2 examples of the IGBA.
So for the IGBA, 2 examples that we have are the ONWA's Nadawin program. So the Nadawin program is, we recognize that Indigenous women have inherent knowledge about how to heal themselves, their families, and their communities, and know the solutions to the issues that they face. When we use the IGBA to understand Indigenous women's experience around precarious housing, this is how we've come to build it, and recognize that housing is a critical issue for Indigenous women. Knowing and having a safe place to live and be where they're safe is really critical, and that in 2022 and 2023, Nadawan supported 480 Indigenous women to be housed in safe, secure, and affordable housing, and continues to propel systemic change. I think one of the critical areas that we did is recognizing that women were at risk of homelessness, and that Indigenous women and 2S persons are disproportionately impacted by housing insecurity and homelessness due to historical and ongoing colonialism. There is a direct contradiction to Indigenous women, girls, and 2S persons' human rights related to housing and safety. UNDRIP insists that Indigenous women be equipped to self-determine responses to their adequate housing need that they experience, as we know that Indigenous women are best positioned to lead the solutions to the issues that they face. When we consider intersectionality, it is important to note how Indigenous women's experiences of housing and homelessness are linked to experiences of violence and heightened vulnerability to being targeted by human traffickers and experiencing justice system involvement, having mental health and addiction needs, and or having child welfare involvement in their families.
Yeah, so when you're looking at the system, and you can see here a bit of the what do you call it, the pathway. So we're looking at everything that we need to address with regarding the housing and housing crisis, and what women have asked us to do. And so when you're looking at one of the community members that we've worked with, you can see the quote here on safety looks like a whole community caring for Indigenous women, loving Indigenous women, uplifting their voices, protecting their children, educating their children, feeding their children. Safety looks like love multiplied. Safety is found at the end of colonial violence. Let's stop the violence, the trauma, let the woman lead. You can see, right here, this is the way of reclaiming voice and listening to what Indigenous women want to need. And that's what we used to have before in our tribal communities. We would have where the community cared for all of us. We shared our resources and nobody went without. And so that's about really looking at when you're addressing an issue such as housing, what we need to do is we have to look at how any type of programming that's being delivered is strength-based and trauma-informed. We have to recognize there's many issues that are impacting us because we haven't had any comprehensive healing as Indigenous people globally on addressing colonization, addressing patriarchy, addressing misogyny, all those pieces. So we have to pick up those responsibilities and make sure we're doing things in a good way, focused in on healing. And we have to then address, fear and distrust from mainstream service providers. We have to build relationships with allies. We need to build relationships with landlords, for instance, be able to educate them and say, like, how can we work on this issue together? Because it's not just an Indigenous issue, it's an everyone's issue. We need everybody at the table to look at how we're going to make change for Indigenous women. And then all those partnerships are based on Indigenous women's needs. We always have to go back to from community up. That grassroots approach up is where change happens.
And I think another big part about our program delivery model is that we pivot a lot. So I think about Nadawan during the COVID times, and how, ONWA staff really shifted how they were able to get people housed during COVID when everything was shut down, the world was shut down. Landlords weren't even meeting people face to face. And so they started doing, walkthroughs of apartments through iPads and, FaceTime so that people could still check out apartments. They were still housing people during, an impossible time. And I think that's because they're so willing to put themselves out there and be creative on how to do their jobs and get the work done.
And our approach works because when you look at during the pandemic, we had to shift to working remotely, us as an agency, and they still continue to house people. And I would talk to our team all the time. I'm like, okay, how are you doing this? How are you building relationships with landlords and people in community and still getting people housed? And our program, as far as we can tell, is the only Indigenous women specific housing and homelessness program here in Canada. There could be others, we just may not know about them. And it's because our program has been designed, developed, is a living model where Indigenous women that we're working with, we refer to as community members. We never refer to community as being clients, because we never want to other anybody. We're always about saying, no, we're in relationship with each other and we are a community together. And so therefore, and we work the same thing with our partners. We need everybody at the table and look at how we can educate people on the issues. And that's how we start to address racism and systemic discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Gretch. Another example of our Indigenous Gender Based Analysis is in 2021. I've had COVID a couple times, so it's like I have no concept of time and space anymore. We did a small research project of the experiences of Indigenous women entrepreneurs, but specifically looking at their experience during COVID. the government reached out to us and gave us a small pot of funding, wanting to know what those entrepreneurs were doing, what it looked like for them. I think we had a small sample that we worked with. We did, 9 one-on-one interviews, and then we had another small sample of 18 people, I think, that completed surveys. And what we realized, and it came from the women that, we were working with for the study, where they recognized that, entrepreneurship was not an open door for them, that they were having to go in and do it, basically building their businesses from the ground up. And they were very solitary when they were doing it. They didn't have a lot of supports. They weren't accessing funded financial institutions to do their work. And most of why they weren't doing that was because the process was so complicated, but also because they weren't coming from, a traditionally financially stable place. So they were often having to recognize that their own financial background they weren't going to get the loans that they needed to do their work. The other big component of the work is that during COVID, some Indigenous women businesses completely shut down because of the type of work they were doing. So we had one business person who was operating a cleaning service. So because the world shut down, she was no longer able to go in and sit and, help her clients. And the funny thing about that particular business is that person, by trade and by her education, was an actual accountant, like a certified accountant, but she looked at her cleaning business as a way to connect with people in her community who needed help. And that's why she chose a cleaning business over, a salaried position at wherever. She probably could have worked forever. Other businesses completely blew up because we were home alone and we needed things to do with our hands. We as an organization recognize the importance of our mental health. And supporting community members in taking care of their mental health. Everybody was so afraid. So arts, craft-based activities became very critical. So some businesses, you could see them shift to being online, web-based businesses. And so it was really amazing how, Indigenous women were being very, very creative in how they were supporting their families and communities during COVID. And I think recognizing that the title of the research report became heart work, because that's what it was to them. They weren't just doing it to make money. Most of the businesses that participated were specifically doing it because it meant something to them. And so it was a really amazing little project. And there's a link in the video, or I don't even know what that is, that thing there. That will take you specifically right to the report. So
yeah. Well, I think what was really interesting, like when we did the engagement, we were speaking to Indigenous women entrepreneurs, and there's, like Ingrid had said, a lot of them were looking at how to step into this space to better support their community. And a good example was with Cheekbone Beauty, and looking at how Jen Harper, one was taking up her responsibilities as an entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. And so looking at how, she was able to create a business that recognizes her, her responsibilities to Mother Earth, building a sustainable project that wasn't harming our environment, all the way through to looking at how she gives back to community. And so that was really, I think, evident for me. And it's like, it wasn't just about building a business for oneself. It was about building a business to support self, family, community, and nation. And so once again, it goes back to our turtle on how we are supporting all of our responsibilities. And, I remember reading a research project many years ago on looking at the skill set for, if you have the skill set to manage living in poverty, that is the same skill set you need to manage a multi-million-dollar business. Okay, so let's, I think a lot of times there's this misperception of other skill sets or othering and giving, but I think we have to recognize we have the skill sets and leadership as Indigenous women. We have the knowledge and abilities to raise our children. We have the skill set to govern and to reclaim our rightful place. And so what we need is, one, we have to take up those spaces. I think it's time for, we're hearing from many Indigenous women, it's time for Indigenous women's leadership. Tina Armstrong and all the children that we work with has given us teachings on, that a teaching of humility. And so one of the teachings of humility, it's not about making yourself small. It's not about being small and being unheard and being unseen. Humility is actually about fulfilling your purpose in life. We all have purpose here in this life, and now it's about us fulfilling that purpose. Humility is about us taking up our responsibility and reclaiming it. And that's what the world needs now. The world needs us as Indigenous women now more than ever. And there's many prophecies that have been heard and shared throughout the years. One of them from my family, one of the prophecies that has been carried on from generation to generation, has been about when Indigenous women take up their rightful place in community once again, communities will change. That's when the healing will begin. And so that is, part of my responsibility and part of the oral tradition that's been passed on to me is for me to, one, I have to step into that role and that responsibility, and I need to pass on that tradition to my daughters. And looking at how, when we step into leadership, we need to lead from our way. We can't be leading from that male-centered leadership. We have to lead from heart-centered leadership. And it's it could be scary. It could be easier to lead from a different way and a different approach. But this is what we have to do as Indigenous women. We need to fulfill our rightful places, in community. And so, I think that's something that we talk about quite a bit over here, even as an organization, on how we lead, how we communicate, how do we address when we're frustrated, especially dealing with systemic racism and discrimination and barriers. So, because there can be a lot of frustrations when you're always in friction with a system, and you're looking at the system. For instance, the United Nations system, it's a very large system. The UN CSW, it's a very large system. It's a very large, like when you're looking at, there was 10,000 people that were at UN CSW 68 this year. And, as Indigenous people, there may have been maybe a couple hundred of us, I'm not sure how many was there. We connected with many while we were down there. And yet there was so much power and beauty behind all of us as Indigenous when we came together, where we can collectively come together and we can influence this very large system as when we come together and we strategize and we work together collectively to say, is there opportunities for us to work together? Is there synergies here? Is the work that we're doing similar to maybe the work that you're doing, and you would like to work with us on? Maybe we come together and we continue to build spaces like this. Maybe we work together on parallel events together where we can share work. We did a parallel event at CSW 68 last week, and we had asked Indigenous women in the room what they would like to see and what do they need for UN to be a safe space for Indigenous women. And the wisdom and knowledge that we got from that room, we heard so loud and clear that it was the first time many of them had voice for the whole week. Like CSW had started on the Monday, and I think our presentation was on Thursday or Friday. It was on Friday. And that was the first time that they had voice. And so for us, it was, disheartening, but also empowering at the same time that we were doing the right thing of building that space. It was a lot of hard work, and our team, so proud of our team working over here, who continues to look at how we listen to understand and we don't listen to respond. And I think that's the work we need to do when breaking down systemic discrimination and racism. We need to listen to the woman. It's going to take longer. And so this is about us listening to women here. We wanted to share and how we amplify youth voices. So one of the most, so last week at UNCSW, there was a youth space that was happening. And during the youth event, we always bring one of our youth board of directors with us whenever we're doing our international work. And what we had did during this one is we had the youth build their own intervention. And unfortunately, as you know, many times not all the interventions are able to be heard. And so Alana Roberts was not able to present her intervention within that space. And so if you remember at the beginning, I talked a bit about, well, you're trying to break down this friction within a system. Sometimes it's easier to build your own system. And so that's what we did here. We said, you know what? Let's still do your intervention. One, let's submit it to UNCSW. We'll submit it electronically through email, but also let's also have you reclaim your voice. And we had asked, are you okay if we will record your intervention in front of the UN? And that's what we had did. It was funny because we had just before that, we were doing drum practice together, myself and my fellow drummers here. And so we're like, we wanted to do a really good shot of us drumming in front of the UN. And we're like, oh boy, people are going to think we're protesting.
They did. They thought that.
But it was just a drum practice. So anybody at the UN and security who thought maybe we were protesting, we just really wanted to get some drum practice in with a really great in the back. Maybe, you know, it's also political protest, you know, drumming at the UN. It could potentially be a little, protesting. So what we're going to do is just take a little bit of time here to share Alana's voice, to give her voice within the space. And we're going to play the video and play her intervention.
Great. We're working on the sound on our end.
Sorry. Yes, it was like, I think this is something that our members have always said to us about, you know, part of storytelling. I think we as Ojibwe people anyway, we're very visual people, and embracing our storytelling the way we do our work. And that's something we're doing here as an organization as well, is instead of always writing a report, we're also creating videos to tell our stories instead of always just like, here's like a 50-page report, but here's also a video that responds to it.
I'm just checking. Can you hear it? Can you hear it?
And largest Indigenous women's organization in Canada. I'm here representing the collective voices of 30 Indigenous women's organizations and our youth. In our teachings, Indigenous youth are a gift from Creator, and each of us form a sacred part of creation. We hold a vital responsibility to ensure the survival and preservation of Mother Earth, our Indigenous languages, and our culture. But we are disproportionately impacted by higher rates and greater depths of poverty, which make it difficult for us to uphold our sacred roles and responsibilities. Our experiences of poverty are gender-based, race-based, and distinct from non-Indigenous women. The poverty experienced by Indigenous youth today is a direct result of colonization and is what our Indigenous leaders have coined as poverty by design. Indigenous youth voices must be heard at these forums, as we are the ones that carry the responsibility of building our future. We urge the Commission and member states to immediately take the following 3 actions. First, prioritize safety and empowerment by ensuring full, effective, and accelerated action on education. Indigenous youth need access to physically and culturally safe spaces for education. In many cases across the country, Indigenous youth in Canada are forced to leave their families and communities to access basic public services like education and healthcare. As a lawyer, I know firsthand the impacts that access to education can have on Indigenous youth's ability to reclaim their roles and responsibilities and reach our full potential. Second, invest in our future by increasing core, sustainable, flexible, and multi-year funding to Indigenous women's organizations. Indigenous women are being mentored to take up their responsibilities to lead organizations that advocate and support Indigenous women and their families. As Indigenous people, we understand that the decisions that we make today impact the next 7 generations. Indigenous women's right to agency is an investment in their safety, security, and success of both our present and future generations. This is key to financing with an Indigenous gender-based perspective and enables us to strengthen our own institutions. Third, hold dedicated spaces for and with Indigenous youth at all future CSWs. Indigenous youth have a right to be heard, and this right is enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and CEDAW General Recommendation 39. We know the solutions to the complex challenges facing our community, and these solutions are grounded in the knowledge of our ancestors and the wisdom of our matriarchs. Indigenous youth voices and rights must inform CSW perspectives and commitments. Kitchi Marcy, thank you.
How do you do this online? You're like snapping your
Yeah.
fingers there?
She's so brilliant.
And so that's part of our role as leaders. You know, we need to make space for our leaders of tomorrow. And, you know, it's something that we're constantly doing. And in our presentation we did on Friday, I think one of the youth that was in the space had called us, you know, they were feeling some of the anti-love in the room. And so I would just like to challenge, if you have an opportunity and you're participating in this space, to always bring youth with you, to mentor them into this space, to make space for their voices in your interventions, and what do they want, you know, because any of the recommendations we're making today is going to impact them in their future. And so we really do need to have their voices and have their leadership and have them at the table. They have a right to be at the table. And they always have, and that's about reclaiming our leadership and our ways of being and knowing. And so we wanted to kind of engage with youths that are on the call. I see there's quite a few here. So we'd love to be able to have your voice included and to give voice to youths. And so we'd like to ask, like, what are what key systems have the most impact on Indigenous women's lives? And so please use the chat function in the Zoom, and we'll populate them up. So Ingrid.
We do have one comment in the chat that has come up from Lori Johnston. Thank you for organizing this in your reports. Can First Nations effectively bring Indigenous women's complaints to the European Court Commission of High Rights or Inter-American Court or Commission on Human Rights? Are their rulings binding on Canada? That's a good question.
Well done.
Yes,
from
Lori Johnston.
Lori Johnson.
Yeah.
Great question, Lori. So we do recognize, a lot of the binding piece is interesting within international law, because we know a lot of it really isn't binding, and it's but not to say that it doesn't mean there's not impact in the rulings, because we do recognize that states do respond, and states are paying attention to the recommendations in the rulings. And a lot of times states will accept the recommendations. What we need to do is, where the gap is, I think, that we're seeing, is on implementation and action. And that's what we have to continue to push for, is implementation and action. And I think, you know, us as Indigenous women, that's where we can come in as advocates, to be able to work with the state to say, let's work together on implementation of, like, you can have, you know, there's probably hundreds of recommendations at this point. You know, maybe we take some time and we prioritize those actions and implement them. We don't need more strategies. We have more than enough strategies to go around. We have so many reports. Now is the time for action. We need to start to pick them up. We need allies in this space. And we as Indigenous people also need to, you know, pick up recommendations that we can and start to act upon them.
Okay. Another comment from Bobby Joe Virtue. Hi, Bobby. Employment rules / terms as it relates to implementing the Indigenous gender-based framework. So this is what key systems have the most impact on Indigenous women's lives. Employment rules / terms as it relates to implementing the Indigenous gender-based framework. I think sometimes for myself, I know my privilege. I know my privilege that I sit in an Indigenous women's world here at ONWA. And we develop these frameworks to support the work, not just of our community members, but just Indigenous women in general. So I could see this being an issue in other organizations or other realms of work, depending like where you're at, and especially if it's government or.
Yeah, and a lot of times and it is a good comment and a good question, because you do recognize a lot of our work is unfunded and unrecognized. And when you're looking at the systemic issues that we're facing, one of them is there is no core sustainable funding for Indigenous women's organizations. And so when you're looking at employment, long-term sustainable employment, and being able to recruit, hire, and retain Indigenous women within your space, that's part of that change that needs to happen. And as Indigenous women's organization, it was always Ingrid that had brought to our attention, because for over many years, our work it's so difficult as Indigenous women, because it isn't recognized and it isn't funded. And a lot of it, you have to do 2 or 3, 4 jobs sometimes in order to get the work done, and we're able to do it. And so always looking at, so we as an organization really do it, everything we can to invest and balance both worlds. We're living in a corporate world, and we're also Indigenous women. And so we're looking always creatively at how we can support our people working in this field, and recognizing that, we're Indigenous women, but we're no longer community members. Like we are community, but when we're in this space, we have to step in as leaders. And so we have to be on our healing journey. So what are we doing as an organization, as ONWA, to support the healing of women, Indigenous women, and all employees working in this space? And so we have, we provide cultural days for Indigenous women to go to ceremony. Where we can, we try to implement wellness days. I think during the pandemic, we recognize mental health, physical health, like our whole being, was at risk. And so we had, we were creative on looking at what can we do to support the leaders fulfilling their roles and responsibilities in community. And so we would give our team full days off. We're always incorporating, we do traditional feasts, and everybody is welcome to join us in there. And we have our programming to be able to ensure that we can look at how we're supporting staff as they're taking up their responsibilities. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Barbara Jo. So we have no other comments at this time on this particular question. Is there another? I think we're asking more questions. So when you consider the CSW 68 theme of accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective, in what ways you are committing to support Indigenous women reclaiming their leadership and their roles?
Yeah, so what are you doing to support Indigenous women, Indigenous women's voice, Indigenous women's leadership? We'd like to, hear from you. And if you currently don't know, but like if you not doing it right now, in what ways can you or will you in the future support Indigenous women's leadership and their voices in the work that you're doing in your systems?
I think too, another way to flip it is, if you're not in the position to commit to, what is it you need in order to have your leadership and voice reclaimed? Like, what is it, so you can answer it from that perspective as well. So if you can use the comments in the chats, we have Tanya Troniak. I see you. Hello, Tanya. How are you? Are you putting it in? Or? Okay, sorry. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm looking at somebody's phone to get the chats, because my old eyes just are going cross-eyed trying to read the chat from here. So I'm not making faces at you, everybody on the line. Okay, so Tana Troniak writes, domestic violence, MMIWG, again, justice system underreporting of crimes, bias and discrimination, lack of culturally culturally, employment, and childcare.
Yeah, those are definitely areas that are preventing us from supporting, but also at the same time, it is a way for us to take the data from these areas on, looking at the bias. There is built-in biases in data. That is a good point. When you're looking at the systemic issues and failures, is the data there, first of all, because you can see that, and also what does and that's a really good point, actually, when you're thinking about the IGBA, and you're looking at biases. And so when you are engaging with Indigenous women, it's critical that the Indigenous women who participated also validate your engagement and your conclusions because of the bias. You need to be able to listen, to understand, and not listen to respond, because when people are telling their story always belongs to them. You never get to take it. And so you have to recognize there is an inherent bias built in. And that's why you always do community validation back to community, say, this is what I heard from you. Is this correct or not? And giving them that opportunity to correct you.
Thank you, Rich. Sharon Jocelyn writes, some communities are joining with Land Justice Futures in the US, working with just transition of land. They were formerly known as nuns and nuns. Nuns spelled N-U-N-S, and then nuns as an N-O-N-E-S.
Open. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And then Michelle Salvateria Peden writes, opening spaces for people to identify as Indigenous, centering their voices and partnering with local Indigenous works. Great.
Yeah, I think that definitely is, I know, especially with identity, I think it is it's a huge conversation right now. You're looking at I was going to use myself as an example. I grew up as a half-breed. That's what they used to refer to us as back then. That was the terminology and language. And you kind of fast forward to Bill C-31, it was 1985, I believe.
Yeah.
And then we became Bill C-31 Indians. So you've got all of this kind of legal legality definitions, legal definitions, and then but you also have your identity of who you are and where you belong and who claims you, and moving forward and reclaiming my identity. I'm very privileged that I was raised in my community, and so I always knew I am an Ojibwe woman. I know where I come from. I know my community. I know my family. And so, but transitioning, and when you're identifying yourself, I know sometimes I like to kind of joke around on how I'm, I'm both Métis and First Nations, and Indigenous and Ojibwe, and depending on kind of how I'm feeling. But it's true though, like looking at identity, and never did I think in my lifetime that it would be cool to be Indigenous. Just it's pretty when you have so many people claiming, Indigenous. And so it's definitely, I think, interesting times in today's world around identity, belonging in our communities. And so thank you for bringing that up and looking at how we're centering Indigenous voices.
One of the other things that I saw recently, I'm a Facebook junkie, I'm watching what everybody's up to, checking things out, but one of the things that one community is doing in Treaty 3 is they're having coming home ceremonies. So they're welcoming people back to the community. Maybe those people that hadn't grown up in the community, maybe knew that, they are just reconnecting with their family. So I think that's a really beautiful way of helping Indigenous women to reclaim their leadership and their voices by including them is a really critical step.
That is beautiful. Like, think about like welcoming home ceremonies and recognizing that we all belong, right? That's something I think we always need to look at is belonging is key to healing. Belonging is key to changing the fabric of our communities going forward. And I know in my language, Ojibwe here around Lake Superior, Anishinaabe means the people. And it doesn't mean one people. It doesn't mean like one specific distinction-based group. It means the people of the community. And So I think that's some of the stuff I think we are reclaiming, and we have lots of learning to do.
Mhm. So Mary Jane Brown Scone writes, I am an Indigenous woman of privilege and seek out community-based initiatives that I can volunteer and support. I speak out with my voice to raise awareness in all spaces. I engage, I create networking space for women to gather, to share in discussions of leadership and mentorship. Hey, Gretch.
Right. I know one part about, when you're volunteering in community-based initiatives, we have many Indigenous people volunteer here. And I remember when we began our full moon ceremonies here as an organization, and the women came here, and one way of them volunteering was to pick up the drum and to learn how to drum. And it actually was a way of reclaiming voice.
Yeah.
And so there's some of our most vocal volunteers in the organization, and they're always here supporting community. So I want to thank you, Mary Jane, for taking up your responsibility and for the work you're doing in your community.
Awesome. Hey, Gretch. Tana Troniak writes, we need to amplify voices of Indigenous women to create opportunities for women to take on leadership roles in many fields.
Oh, definitely. Thank you, Tana. Yeah, that's what we had heard last week during the side event, is that we need Indigenous women in every role, right? So leading shelters, Indigenous women, directing finance, in the science sector, as entrepreneurs, as politicians, as
chiefs.
As chiefs.
That's what we heard at the She Is Wise conference, is that, we need more Indigenous women chiefs.
Yeah.
So
It's true.
let's make that happen. So I think we have another chat coming from Mary Jane.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's critical when you're looking at breaking down systemic issues and reclaiming. It's about reclaiming in all spaces. I think that's where the bigger impact's going to come from.
And Mary Jane writes, yes to the opportunity to reclaim voice. Lori Johnson writes, committed to supporting Indigenous women. Thank you. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you. That was something we had, we were at one of the sessions last week in New York. Senator McFedrin had coordinated a session, and one of the key messages we had brought forward specifically to UNCSW as a whole was on what privilege are we prepared to give up in order to make space for Indigenous women. And, it was a really great, because many women came up to us after and said, I'm prepared to give up privilege. What can I do to help?
Michelle writes, my organization works in the US, Southeast, Caribbean, and Central America, and indigeneity feels a little more obscure, nuanced in Latin X communities, but still feels important to not whitewash the culture and identity.
It's true. Yeah.
No, definitely. I'm grateful to work in an organization that recognizes the importance of who we are as Indigenous women. And we back that up by ensuring that we have ceremony. I was just telling the group before we got here, I said, I feel like I'm like in a different universe, because yesterday I was able to sit in ceremony and learn some teachings around the bear teachings. And then the night before that, I had gone into a sweat with my team to support us in our work that we're doing to, help us get strong and be able to carry the stories that we hear. And so definitely recognizing the importance of culture and how that supports the work that we do to support Indigenous women. Jennifer Campbell writes, I am a GBA plus practitioner in the federal government. I am working to better inform myself on the specific concerns and desires of Indigenous women in my area of work so that I can be a stronger ally and provide Indigenous women space to speak and share their stories. Yeah,
that's critical, especially when you're looking at, that's a good one, because when you're looking at the GBA and the federal government, and there's the missing component of the GBA is looking at the uniqueness of being Indigenous woman. And I think that's like where we always have to look at different systems, because as Indigenous women, we're not always fitting within the feminist framework, because there's no recognition of the issues we're facing because of colonization and patriarchy. And it's because of two factors with us that has makes us unique. It's like, one, because we're Indigenous, and two, because we're women. And those two factors together is the reasons why we're facing so much issue. So if you're looking at within the federal system, over 50% of the federal population, federal inmate population, are now Indigenous women. And so we have to look at, you know, where are investments going here federally towards Indigenous women. And so when you're looking at budgeting, and I think Canada did, was it 2 billion or something for MMIWG, and looking at the outcomes for that. And so it's great to have those investments, and is the outcomes relating to increasing safety for Indigenous women. And that's some of the policy decisions that we need to think about with investments when looking at, you know, some of those issues, and looking at, you know, we as a country are investing in Indigenous women, but are we investing in the right spaces to make change, make that systemic change, especially when you're looking at, you know, the justice system, right? What's the experience of Indigenous women within the justice system? And we have over 50% Indigenous women within that system. We also know that a lot of times it's because of the violations in probation violations. And so it's not because of new crimes that were overrepresented in the justice system, but it's because of the systemic failure. So I'm loving that you're here today, looking at how you can be an ally and how you can help make that change in that system.
No, definitely. And I think about the justice system and how it intersects with this issue at the CSW about girls by addressing poverty. We know that a lot of those women sitting in federal prisons are in there because of poverty-based crimes. So it's definitely a huge issue. So Tana Troniak writes, and the more feedback we get, we're listening. And so I love that as an organization, when we say that we listen to Indigenous women and then we try to implement work to support what we hear is always great. So Tana writes, we need to create an Indigenous Toastmaster course to help us feel we can speak up. Some of us are quiet people.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
that's definitely.
Yeah.
You're looking at a severe introvert here.
I agree. I remember like kind of being pushed out in front to speak. I would have loved to have had a Toastmaster, and I think to learn how to do this, I was like, oh, I don't know, what am I going to say?
Well,
but I agree.
Again, when I was leaving Kenora back in like a million years ago, we're developing one, and that Toastmaster program is still ongoing. So we'll get some background
Yeah.
info on that, and we'll figure out how to support us to implement that.
Yeah,
So
I like that.
great idea.
Yep. We're in the middle of operational planning, so it's a
Yeah.
perfect opportunity to add more stuff.
Bethany is writing it down as we speak.
So I think there was another.
Was there another comment? Okay,
Yeah.
Here it comes. Ooh, Catherine Chichu.
Hey, Kathy.
Hello, Miigwech Chanwa for hosting this space. I am committed to learning from my aunties and grandmothers on my ways of knowing as a Mushkego woman. I am committed to helping my daughters and nieces by modeling our ways of doing with harvesting and reclaiming our food systems. This is essential to reclaim and revitalize our ways of being, specific to my home community and our relationship with the land, the water, and all beings. Nurturing these relationships are key for me in nurturing my natural roles as a leader in my community.
Oh,
Making me cry. Then I cry now.
that was going to happen, Catherine. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your commitment, and thank you for sharing your responsibilities and what you're doing, because this is what we need. This is what this is where the change, where our grandchildren's grandchildren are being made, because we're breaking the cycles. We're breaking the cycle of violence through healing. And so the next.
Yeah, so our next question is it's on a Menti, so you can see the QR code there. If you scan that into your phone, I think Tana has one more comment, but I'll just keep explaining this before. And so what we want to know is, how will you mobilize the knowledge that was shared in the work that you do? So how will you take the IGBA that we've discussed and fit it into the work that you're doing? Tana's comment is, but we have to not be linked to the justice system, independent staff.
Yeah,
So, you know,
advocates.
yeah.
Yeah,
We
that's,
can't be employed by the jail to
yes.
help, yeah, you know, help the people in the jail.
No, it's true. Like we're looking at, you know, some of the impact we were able to make, for instance, within child welfare, and the hundreds of children were able to get back home to be with moms. And it's because we're working outside the system with advocates. So once again, remember I was talking about, you can come up against friction when dealing with systemic issues, or you can build like a new system and a new pathway. Sometimes that's what it takes in order to make the change.
As we're listening, we have another comment from Suzanne Hides. Hello, I am not Indigenous or even Canadian, but I am fascinated by your communities and the work of ONWA and your approaches. Is there anything the international community can do to support? Love from the United Kingdom.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's exactly what we're looking for, is we need allies. And you know, we asked the question last week from Indigenous women, what does allyship look like for you?
Mhm.
And it was about helping amplify Indigenous women's voices, and particularly within the space of UNCSW, we had some allies who have ECOSOC status, and many Indigenous women's organizations do not have ECOSOC yet. And so offering up some of their seats in order to make space for Indigenous women. So that's when we're looking at, and also within the UNCSW, we're currently advocating for, right now, there's planning going on for the next 4 years on priority themes. And we would like to see an Indigenous woman's priority theme first. So we're looking for support on that. And in addition to that, looking for permanent space for Indigenous women within the CSW space and within all international places. And so we have to look at some of how do we break down the system to make space for Indigenous women. And we just want to thank you, Valerie.
Mhm. Oh, no, that was Suzanne.
Sorry, Suzanne, sorry.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
You can read our reports too and look at some of the recommendations, and you pick up a recommendation and start working on it.
I think in this day and age, I'm always shocked as an Indigenous woman when I speak to other people or people in other countries that they don't know about the residential school experience here in Canada, and they don't know about the 60s scoop. You know, so those are some things that, you know, education is knowledge, and knowledge in action equals power, sort of thing. So we need all the help we can get. Thank you, Suzanne. Valerie Gozen writes, my career retired now. I hear that when you retire that it's more work. So, and just something I'm hearing, led me to be able to help educate non-Indigenous workers how they can work with our families. We need to encourage our young people to follow this lead to keep the learning happening.
Yeah, that's true.
No, definitely. That's a very good comment. Thank you, Valerie. Some of the Menti comments that we're hearing back regarding how will you mobilize the knowledge that was shared in the work that you do is share it amongst the people that I work with and the people we support within the chapters. Another comment is create spaces that are not tokenistic to allow for meaningful engagement and communication. As an ally, I can reach out to Indigenous organizations to start building relationships and see where we can work together and amplify their work. And another comment from the Menti is add the Indigenous women's intersectionality flower to our GBA Plus training materials to build clearer understanding of the Indigenous Gender Based Analysis Plus.
And one part of that within, so here in Canada, we do have an opportunity to make systemic change with Indigenous women's voices, and it's within the nation to nation policy. And so right now, I don't think a lot of people realize is that Indigenous women's voices in community are not being included in public policy, because we're only working with only national Indigenous organizations. And we're not saying to not do that approach. What we are saying is that the plus is always there, and that we always need to look at how we're restoring Indigenous women's leadership and recognizing our governance. And through UNDRIP and through General Recommendation 39, the rights of Indigenous women, we have a right to our own agencies and the right to decide who represents us in the right to agency. And so what we need to do is we have to have inclusion of Indigenous women from community up. We have to have inclusion of all urban Indigenous organizations. And so because this is how we need to restore our leadership, how we restore our governance, and how we restore our relationships. So ultimately, we're looking at, there's a change model, and I can't remember who built it, on looking at how to make the most effective change. And it's, you're looking at taking the pyramid, and the top part of the pyramid is to tell, I'm going to tell Ingrid to take a drink of water. That's good. The next part is about relate, right? Where we can relate to issues that we may be facing. And the most impactful way to make change is through modeling, so role modeling. And so that's what we're always doing, is looking at how are we role modeling the change we want to see, and how are we, when we're talking about inclusion of voice, and we're talking about reconciliation, what does reconciliation with Indigenous women look like? It looks like we are including everyone in public policy, because we know good public policy comes from many diverse voices, comes from the many voices on the ground in community up. And we have to include all urban Indigenous organizations and agencies, and we have to include Indigenous women from community up and our agency into all public policy.
Wonderful. So our tech team shares, please be sure to visit the chat in the Zoom to find several resources and links, including ONWA's website. Other comments from Menti. Today, we reinforced the community development principle of working from the ground up. I also appreciated community, not client. Another comment, advocate for funding for more sessions like this online and in community. And to support women of self-identified Indigenous people so they can be better heard among their own people, nation, state, and world.
It's a good point. I'm not sure who made the comment on community development. That's where change happens. Like, that's the beauty of everything, to be honest. Like, when you're looking at, we begin where community is at, and we work with community to do their own community development approaches. And so when you're looking at like a nation to nation top-down approach versus a community development up approach, we need to be able to start public policy and to start advocacy and development from community up. And that's how we've always governed each other, like in our tribal communities, in our traditional ways of being. It's always been based on the uniqueness of each community. So we're here in Thunder Bay. Many of you may know a bit about Thunder Bay. We tend to make international news sometimes in this community. And so what happens here in our community, it's unique to us. And so we have to begin to look at, Indigenous women's safety in our community is going to look completely different than a community in the United States, for instance, or within the United Kingdom, because we have different safety issues we have to address. And even here in Ontario, the unique safety needs of women here in Thunder Bay versus in Niagara, or versus in other areas of the province, it's all unique. And so that's why we have to do community development approaches.
I think recognizing that is that one of our models is that we never go into a community feeling like we're the experts. We recognize that Indigenous women in community are the experts in their lives, and they have the solutions for any issues that they are experiencing. So going to them and supporting them in the work that they're doing, or in the work that they want to do, has always been our approach to community development. And I think it's, it's what works. We know that it works. And so helping Indigenous women to identify the supports that they need to make change has always been critical and a focus of our work at ONWA.
Yeah, I think sometimes people have asked us over the years on how we've managed to mobilize ONWA to be the organization it is today. And it's, it's a really simple strategy, like a very, we listen to women in community on what they want, and that's what we do. It's like women have guided us and directed us that we need to do like all of this work. There's more than enough work to go around. And then it's up to us to strategize and action it. So it's not about taking, years to research and analyze and strategize and plan. It's about, you know, hearing the woman and actioning their change, because, you know, Indigenous women have right for safety. And I think a lot of us, I know me personally, I'm here doing this work because I want a safer, better world for my grandchildren's grandchildren. And, you know, that's what we had heard at Healing Our Spirits Worldwide, why a lot of us do the work that we do. It's because we want to have a better world.
Yeah. And we know that the women that have come before us, those leaders, those aunties, those mothers, our mothers, and that's what they were doing for us. And so just picking up what, you know, the work from them to carry it on into the next generation is always critical.
And that's a good point, because we always have to recognize those that have come before us.
Mhm.
You know, we're able to be here today to pick up our language, to pick up our medicine bundles, that we can openly practice our culture and our teachings. You know, that fact that we were able to have a drum practice in front of the United Nations in New York, you know, when you think about when our grandparents and parents were doing advocacy, that was not a safe thing to do.
Mhm.
It's not always completely safe for us, but it's definitely a lot safer because of the path they did. And, you know, they spoke their culture, they practiced their ceremonies, when it wasn't safe to do so. And even when the conversation around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was not always a safe conversation to be had.
Mhm.
But they continue to do it anyway. They bravely and courageously continue to speak their truth. They've advocated. We watched a warrior woman's movie that was,
The Warrior Woman Project, and it was about Madonna Thunderhawk
yeah,
and the work that she's doing to protect land and defend ways of being. And she actually gave a whole other perspective on you know, the American Indian movement, that from a women's perspective. And for her, it was about making sure that everybody was included and everybody was cared for. And you know, and you could see in the video of how that work was generational. There were her sisters and there was her daughter, and you know, it was interesting to see her daughter's take on her mother's work. She's like, sometimes I have to look at my mother as an activist and realize that because she was that activist, she couldn't be there for me as a mother. And I have to honor her in that way as her daughter, not as her daughter, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So that relationship piece between mothers and daughters and aunties and grandmothers in doing this work is really critical in terms of carrying the work and doing the work for the people. And, you know, coming out of ceremony recently, it's just one of the things that, you know, I'm grateful to hear is that, you know, the work that I'm doing in terms of servicing and being a service to people, to our people, is what is important at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So
And I just wanted to also recognize, we also met on a number of occasions last week with the Maori Women's Welfare League and the advocacy and work that they're doing in their communities. And I just wanted to thank them and really thank all Indigenous women for picking up your responsibilities, for continuing to walk your healing journey, regardless of the barriers we continue to face. You know, there's so many barriers facing violence 365 days a year, and still continuing to push through and being the resilient leaders that you are. And so I just wanted to thank you. And I wasn't too sure. I was going to say if there's any final questions or thoughts from the, it says that we're currently frozen. I'm not sure if it's still frozen.
we do have a comment from somebody called Silver Lining. I really love your name. Will the record be shared on any platform? And the answer is yes. This session will be available to watch later today on ONWA.ca. Do I need to read out? The tag will be in the, yeah, I aged myself at the last presentation because I said www.onwa.ca. Apparently you don't have to say the www anymore. So I'm old. But yeah, so we'll put the link in the chat. I think it's probably there already.
Yeah.
They're fast.
Yeah. So any final questions or comments before we wrap up? And just wanted to thank everyone for participating here today and for your engagement and for listening to us. And you know, well, thank you for that. Thank you to Ingrid for, you know, being here, for her humor, for her presence, her teachings.
Oh, me, Birch. I don't think we have any more comments, but again, really grateful for everybody to join us and that, you know, I think this is an amazing way for us to include people. I think that I said that about COVID and the fact that I was able to join things that were happening in England and, you know, so this technology is a tool to ensure that Indigenous women are able to participate in things that we normally wouldn't be able to because of resources or lack of resources to actually get there or know about it. So I want to personally thank everybody for joining us and listening and sharing your wonderful ideas and knowledge about this. And we definitely will take this back and incorporate it into our ongoing work.
And we do have, so following from here, we will be participating in the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous people. And so feel free to join us there. If you're going to be there in person, we're going to be hosting 2 parallel events there as well. And something else that we're working on, that, you know, from a follow-up from our last week's, is that we want to start developing toolkits to help support Indigenous women in their advocacy efforts internationally. I think that, international advocacy it's one option. It's another tool in our advocacy toolkits. And so it's not the only option to be able to make that systemic change. But once again, it's like, what we're hearing, we need to be in all places and at all tables, making decisions and making movement. So that's it. Yeah. Miigwech, everyone. So final questions. So I want to thank everyone for being here today. Miigwech Matna, merci, Niawango.
Have a great day. Oh, love ONWA. I love ONWA too. I think there's an actual question.
Oh,
It's coming.
I think next time we need to have the questions on a little side panel. I think.
Mary Jane Brownstone writes, I love ONWA. Is there like organizations in all provinces?
There's similar type of organizations, I think smaller ones, and it's largely because there is no core sustainable funding to do Indigenous women specific work here in Canada. I'm not sure globally we're not hearing of much of that either, and so that we have to recognize and make that change that Indigenous women are not projects, so we can't invest into Indigenous women based on project-based funding. We need to see core sustainable funding for Indigenous women's organizations to develop into their own community-based organizations. ONWA, we've managed to do a patchwork quilt of funding in order to build our capacity. So those quilts that maybe some of your grandmothers may have made. I know my grandmother made quilts, and you'd put together all these little bundles of fabric, and that's what we managed to do, is build our agency off of these different projects. It's a lot more difficult in order to do the work, but so I know across Canada and different provinces there is some similar type organizations. Okay, great.
That's it for us.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great day and hope to see you at the permanent forum.
Okay.
Miigwech.